Good day, everyone, wherever you are and whenever you watch this presentation. Isn't it wonderful that we can actually communicate this way? Do you know how long internet has existed? 26 years, only 26 years. Imagine COVID-19 could have happened in the 1990s and we wouldn't have been able to do this. Well, technological revolutions do make a difference. And today we're going to take advantage of it. Thanks for being there. So today I'm going to talk to you about technological revolutions and the shape of tomorrow. In fact, I'm going to try to explain why the future is not always the continuation of the recent past. Sometimes we think that things will just continue the way they seem to be, they threaten to be, they offer to be. In fact, I will try to give some explanations of how we do shape the future. So we'll first ask whether predicting the future is really easy, then why studying past patterns can help. We will try to figure out where we are now in terms of the understanding of those patterns. Then how do we shape the future? And finally, what could be the role of COVID-19 in the way the future looks? We all know that the future is not always easy to predict or to prefigure. In fact, imagine in the middle of the 1930s depression, it would really have sounded incredible if somebody said that blue-collar workers would have lifetime jobs and fully equipped suburban houses with a car at the door. No way. And yet it happened. Increasing wages created many more millions of consumers for mass production and sustained growth. So it was good for people and it was good for the economy to do that incredible thing. Another incredible thing at the time would have been to say that most colonies would gain independence. Imagine the British Empire broken up, the French Empire broken up. Nobody would have believed it. And yet it was fantastic. It happened and it was good for the economy because the rising middle classes in the developing world adopted the American way of life. So it widened world markets for mass production. So it was good even for the empires to have lost their empires. Or imagine in the late 60s, if somebody had said, you see the hippies? Well, some of their values, like back to natural materials, organic food, no way. That's impossible, that they would become the luxury norms. It would have been incredible. And of course, you know that it happened. Innovations in natural textile fibers have transformed the world of textiles, and innovations in distribution logistics have made organic foods the premium segment in supermarkets. So you know what? With predictions in the middle of a technological revolution, it's safer to be bold than to be timid. So today we're going to be bold. But I'm going to give you another example. It was not so easy to see the future of the horseless carriage. You know what that is? That was an automobile. In 1898, that was an automobile. Now you have the driver sitting in front of his imaginary horse because he holds the wheel as if it were reins. And under him, there was the engine, which was then measured in horsepower, and today too. So that was the beginning. It still looked like a horseless carriage, but then it turned into that. A mass-produced automobile, completely now giving its full capacity. So let's remember that when we think of how the future could be. The future could be wonderful. It could be very different from what it looks like now. Everybody worrying about unemployment from artificial intelligence and robotics and all these things and all the inequality we're seeing now. Maybe we could have a much better future than it promises if we look at conditions now. And that's because the new paradigm always comes wrapped in the old. So we've got to get rid of the old ideas and we've got to have the new ideas. We've got to be able to think really boldly. And by the way, the young are much better than that, at that than we are. So let's study past patterns. Let's see what the past can do to help us imagine what the future could be like. First of all, you know, we always think of progress as a very continuous thing, but in fact, technological advance is constant. We always have technological advance, but it's not continuous. What happens is that progress in market economies occurs in successive surges of transformation, one's replacing the other, and it's a very destructive process. They define different ways of producing and living, and it takes a long time for us to learn how to absorb them, how to assimilate them. We have had 5 technological revolutions in the past 240 years. First, we had the Industrial Revolution, machines, factories, and canals. You know, for the people at the time, canals were like the internet, equally marvelous. They united everything. They made everything simple. You could go from one river to another. There were even canals that went over rivers, like a bridge. Quite amazing. Anyway, that was the time when machines were introduced, and that was a big, big change at the time. Then we have the age of railways, really the age of steam, coal, iron, and railways, which was also a huge transformation, followed by the age of steel and heavy engineering, the first globalization when we had electrical, chemical, civil, and naval engineering. We had the steamships that allowed travel very quickly from the south to the north and actually created the first global market for wheat, for meat, for all these things. And we had the whole of the southern hemisphere, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Argentina, all incorporated into the world economy. Then we have the next revolution, which we are more familiar with, the age of the automobile, oil, plastics, and mass production, followed by our current information technology and telecommunications, which, by the way, is only halfway along its path. That's why that arrow is only halfway. We still have the whole of the golden age of this revolution to see. And what could come next? We don't know. The age of biotech, nanotech, bioelectronics, and new materials, maybe. We don't know. But one thing we do know, it never appears out of nowhere. Every revolution has been in the wings. It's been around. Think, for instance, of the computers. It's only after the microprocessor makes the computer on a chip that we can really have the information revolution. But computers were invented in the Second World War, and IBM was making big, huge computers throughout the whole of the mass production golden age. However, the real revolution, the things that we now, you know, the mobile phone and all these things and artificial intelligence, you know, the really big transformations are to come afterwards. But in order to know what the next revolution is, we can look around, because it's always the elements of it, not with the main breakthroughs, but the elements will be there. So what happens with each of these? A techno-economic and socio-institutional shift. So society is very different from what it was before. And it also brings a new paradigm for innovation and profitability. So it changes strategies, it changes the way business acts, and it has to also change the way government regulates whatever happens. But each revolution has a double nature. On the one hand, we have the radical new technologies. Those are the big things that we always see. A powerful cluster of new and dynamic technologies, products, industries, and infrastructure. So it's always an infrastructure. This time, of course, it's telecoms and internet. And what they bring is explosive growth and structural change with new engines of growth. The FANGs, you know, the Silicon Valley giants, those are the new engines of growth. No longer oil and automobiles, which were the engines of growth in the previous one. So, but at the same time, we have something which is perhaps even more important, which is a new techno-economic paradigm. The logic of business changes. So we have an interrelated set of generic technologies, which means that they are applied to everything, and of organizational principles capable of upgrading all the mature industries and enabling widespread innovation. When one paradigm is over, when one revolution is spent, like the mass production revolution is spent, all its industries become mature, and they are not very profitable, and they have all sorts of problems, and they have to renew themselves. Just look at the automobile industry, the amount of innovation that's occurring there in order to upgrade and transform an industry that had matured and that was the central industry in the previous revolution. So as we do this, as we transform every single industry with these innovations, we actually get a quantum jump in attainable productivity and quality across all sectors. We still don't have it. Everybody's complaining that productivity is not increasing. It's because we're not still in the golden age of this revolution. It's when we leap into that real future that we get the productivity leap and we get the real growth across the whole economy. So in fact, what we now have is an enormous new potential for wealth creation. And it's gradually transforming the whole economy as well as society and institutions. Actually, society and institutions, especially as concerns all the things that have to do with government, generally only get transformed when everything else has been transformed. There is a particular inertia in that. So what changes too is the spectrum of opportunities for all. So let's take a look at the paradigm shift that's taking place since the 1970s. The first and most important thing, perhaps, is that we're going from mass production processes to what can be seen as flexible, adaptable volume production. Let's distinguish between mass production and volume production. Mass production does involve volume, but basically the most important feature was that it was identical. So you had to, it was very important for products to be identical because that's what reduced the cost. Now we have the possibility of flexible, adaptable, customized volume. Even though the volume is much, much greater, it can now be with changeable production, and that's a huge change. Then we have another major change, which is that it used to be that the technologies would try to turn services into products. They would do, say, the washing machine. So you have all those electrical appliances actually turned what used to be services into products. So now we're doing the opposite. These technologies are able to turn products into services. So we no longer have record players or tape recorders, we just streamed, and so on, with many things that are still to be done to turn products into services. That's one of the main features also of this paradigm. Then another thing is going from those closed pyramids and the isolated firms, you know, everything. Now we have open networks, we have platforms, both at the local and at the global level. Stable routines, you know, we used to have printed manuals, you know, this is what you do, that was Taylorism. Now we have continuous improvement with participation of the workers. So of course, if the workers are participating, they're no longer just human resources where you put them in, you have human capital. You're talking about the value of knowledge, the value of skills, the value of experience, which, by the way, is also rewarded economically. Then we go from rigid Tayloristic organizations to flexible learning organizations. So everything changes with that continuous improvement with worker participation. Suppliers and clients were really hands-off suppliers and clients. Now they are value network partners. So you actually collaborate. Some companies actually fund the the improvement and the R&D and all the innovations in their suppliers, and they share the training that they give their personnel and things like that, because it is very important. And clients too, because clients give you feedback. From fixed plans, we go to adaptive strategies with central guidelines and the possibility of local flexibility. You empower personnel to respond to the centrally given strategies and guidelines. From economies of scale, we're going to economies of scale, of scope, of specialization, of networks, and who knows what else. I mean, it is now, there are all sorts of ways of achieving economies now. It used to be that if you didn't achieve scale, you got nothing. Of course, we still have economies of scale, and even much greater, but we also have all the others. Then a very important aspect is the world of international trade and international economies, where you had all the national economies relating. We now have globalization, but it's very important to understand that globalization is not about eliminating the political entities, but it's actually about the global economy. So the economy acts globally, the economic actors act globally, but we have local shaping policies. So we probably will end up with a whole range. I mean, the most intelligent solution for this paradigm would be to have different layers of government, from the local through the national, all the way to the supranational and the global. We need some global entities to control some things which are global, like, for instance, the movement of finance, which should somehow, which is no longer possible. It's no longer possible to control it from the national level, because it just becomes, finance just responds to any regulation against it, but just moving out. So you can't have an economy that works on a global scale without having some sort of global regulation. Then we have the move from three-tier markets, stable ones. It used to be large, medium, small, expensive, not so expensive, and cheap, and so on. Now we have highly segmented dynamic markets. We have everything from the most commodity super standard thing all the way to very customized and also specialized for special niches and so on. So in fact, it is better for business to be in a niche than to be in a commodity market. So that is a big, big change too. And of course, it used to be that environmental concerns were not even in anybody's mind. We never thought that the environment was a problem. The environment was just the source of all the wealth, that all the materials and all the things that we need for production. Now the environment has become a guide to innovation, and it will become more and more so as we understand better how important it is to respect the climate and to respect the planet, so that we can continue living well in it. So it's really a radical change in best practice common sense, but of course it's being gradually and unevenly adopted. So when we're all in this paradigm, when everybody has moved on, that's when we really get the proper golden age. But the process is not simple. These changes don't just happen and then everybody just adopts them. No, in fact, resistance makes each revolution begin as a huge experiment where people learn the new ideas and the new technologies and the new way of using them, the best way of using them. And that experiment has high rewards, but it ends in a financial bubble. So the process is complex. The diffusion process is broken in two by the bubble collapse. So we have the first 20 or 30 years is the installation period, which ends in a bubble, as I just said, with a big crash. We could have two bubbles like we've had now, or three, because COVID is like a third bubble crash. Then we have what I've called a turning point, which is a recession, which can last from 2 to 15 years or any amount of years, while a sort of recessive period that You go back and forth until you finally get to the deployment period, which is when the whole paradigm allows for a true golden age. So what's the installation period like? Well, it's the time when finance takes control, forcing the new paradigm against the old. So, you know, it's what happened in the 80s and the 90s, and people were having to transform their strategies and their whole conception of their business. Even IBM had this huge transformation, turned into a service company and so on. So that's the time. But finance forces you, and if you don't want to do what finance says, then you don't get money. So that's like what happened in fact, it's still in a way happening. It's a time of turbulent and unequal creative destruction. That's how Schumpeter called it. When the new destroys the old, and it is creative both in the sense that it's new and in the sense that it creates new conditions for others to follow. And then we have that recessionary sort of period when you have instability and uncertainty, social unrest, you get populism. I'll speak a bit more about that in a moment. And then we finally get to the golden age of creative construction, when we have a proactive state that sets a win-win game between business and society, and we finally get all the social benefit, all the benefits and profit benefits also from the revolution, which is now fully installed and can be deployed across the whole economy. So where are we? We are here. We are still in this uncertain period of instability and social unrest and populism and all these things. That is where we are. But this has happened before, and each time it has been followed by a golden age. So if we look at the historical record, we see a regular sequence that goes from bubbles to golden ages. So we have, in each revolution, we had the canal mania, the railway mania, the multiple global booms of the Gilded Age. In fact, most of the crashes happened not in England, which was the center of the world at the time, but everywhere else. Argentina was one of the big crashes, the US, New Zealand, Australia, all the ones that had boomed, that's where the crashes happened. Then we have the Roaring 20s, very much centered in the US, but affecting the whole world. And now we have had first the dot-com boom, then the global casino, and now actually with the COVID pandemic, we also had the financial collapse that was expected. I will also mention a little bit more about that in a moment. So that has been followed by golden age prosperities. The Great British Leap, the Victorian boom in the second, the Belle Epoque in Europe and progressive era in the US, the post-war golden age, and now I suggest that we could have ahead a sustainable global ICT golden age, which will lift all boats so that everybody could be better. I know it doesn't sound realistic. I know it doesn't sound realistic. However, I just told you that nobody could believe in the middle of the 1930s that workers would have a full life with a house full of electrical appliances, with a car at the door, with their children in school, with their children going to university, blue-collar workers. Could you have believed it? Well, please believe this, because this is equally possible. Because it is possible technologically. When something is possible technologically, it's a question of socio-political decision whether it actually happens in the end. So the adequate parallel for today is a 1930s turning point. So the adequate parallel for tomorrow is a golden age. Let's look at the 20th century so you see how this thing works out. I mean, this is the time that we know best because it's much nearer. So let's look at how the whole thing happens. Here we have the usual S-curve of how technologies diffuse from introduction to maturity for the age of oil, automobiles, and mass production, which took the best part of the 20th century. But it also had the end of the age of steel and heavy engineering at the beginning. And it also had the beginning of the age of information technology and global telecommunications, which is where we are now. So how did it begin? It began with the Belle Epoque in Europe and the progressive era in the US. And then while the US was already in eruption of the mass production revolution, Europe was still in the maturity of that age of heavy engineering and was involved in World War I. So Ford's Model T initiates the mass production revolution. And then we end up with the roaring 20s, the frenzied bubble, and the big crash of 1929. Then we have the 1930s, recession, depression, and the World War. And at the end, Bretton Woods, welfare state, Marshall Plan give us the synergy period of 1943, 45, actually, even before the war, there was already in the US, the beginning of this golden age. So after that, we had the maturity of the golden age, which is when the hippies come out, you have social unrest, you have the Vietnam War, because in fact, when a technology is maturing, when a technological revolution is maturing, it can no longer deliver the promises that you saw at the beginning. So that's too complex to discuss now, but that's one of the phenomena that has happened with each technological revolution. So after that, we have in 1971, the Intel microprocessor, which is the big bang that initiates this revolution. And then we have the oil crisis, which is sort of like the end of the cheap product that made, because every time there is something cheap and powerful, every technological revolution, steel oil in the mass production, steel in the first globalization, coal in the age of railways, and so on. So our cheap factor in this case is the microprocessor that begins the whole thing. So we have the oil crisis, the end of cheap oil, redeployment to the third world, Brazil, Korea miracles, and what was painful for everybody, stagflation. At the same time, inflation and unemployment, so the Keynesian policies couldn't work anymore. And then the free market people, the way of thinking that you have to get rid of the state, found it much easier to convince, because of course, Keynesian policies were good for the golden age, but they were no longer good for a moment like this. So that's why we get the Reagan-Thatcher revolutions, which were the way of abandoning that and creating the free market period, which is very important for the eruption of a technological revolution, because what you need when you have a technological revolution is to have the freedom to experiment. It's a huge experiment that brings all the new technologies. You start learning about them, you get to a bubble, you have then the rejuvenation of the mass production industries at the same time as you have all the new industries too, and of course, globalization. So we had then the collapses in Asia, the NASDAQ, the stock market, the housing bubbles, the banks, the whole thing, which of course happened also in 2008. But let's look a little bit also at how this whole process worked out in terms of the socio-political things. We had the Russian Revolution in 1917. We had fascism in Italy in the 20s, Nazis in Germany in the 30s. And then we come out of that with social democracy. But since the Russian Revolution survived, then we had the Cold War as characteristic of that whole period. And then when that technological revolution was mature and declining, that was the end of the Soviet system. The Soviet system did not have any mechanisms to create a revolution. It adopted computers, it even made microprocessors, but it was not capable of transforming the economy because it was a bureaucratic, very stiff thing that had no renewal mechanisms. So it didn't end with a huge revolution. It just dissolved because there was nothing left, because it didn't have any technology to drive it. So that's when we get the booms in the other side. And of course, we get crashes each time. So each revolution first worsens inequality and then reduces it. Let's look at the well-known Piketty and size figures about the percent of declared income earned by the top 1% of taxpayers in the US. This one includes the capital gains. Look at this. This is the 1920s. This is the, when the roaring 20s, and then we have the crash of the 1930s. And here we have our own bubbles, the NASDAQ bubble and the 2000s bubble. Look at how income is distributed. We have the top 1% receiving 25%, almost 23, 22, 23% of all income. Look at what happens in the golden age. Look at what happens in the deployment period. That amount comes down to 10%, but 10% of a lot. So really, when you have a golden age, everybody benefits. That's the whole idea. That means that the level of inequality is not technologically determined, but it is a socio-political issue. It's because the welfare state came in after the war that we actually have inequality coming down. So it's not because mass production destroyed jobs, which it did in manufacturing and created only the assembly line, all the skilled jobs gone. It destroyed all the jobs in agriculture by mechanizing agriculture, bringing in fertilizers and all sorts of petrochemical things for herbicides and so on. So it becomes a very high-tech thing, which comes down from about half the population employed to about 4 or 5% and even less. So of course, technology does destroy a lot of jobs and it does create inequality at first. But if we come in as a society with the power of the state and the power of political movements, we can transform those technologies into a much better life for everybody, generally by changing lifestyles. I cannot talk too much about this, but some of you might be interested in reading some of my things in my webpage, which I will give you at the end. So you will see the role of lifestyles in how we do get to full employment again, even though technologies destroy many. So where are we now? We have been saying that we are at the turning point. What is this turning point? What is this moment where we are? What's the nature of it? So let's talk about the nature of the turning point. As in the 1930s and now, we have structural unemployment, of which much has been revealed now with the COVID-19 problem. We have de-skilling, of course, plus inequality, about which we have also been learning now and for quite a while. Hopelessness, of course. Casino finance, which is about betting on finance itself rather than investing in the real economy. We have giant monopolies and we don't know what to do about them. And this has always happened. We also had Rockefeller's empire having to be broken up at that time because this is a phenomenon typical of technological revolutions. We have feeble growth. We have been very excited about 1% growth or something, and 1.5%, which was very little compared to past golden ages. Talk of secular stagnation. In fact, the first time the term was used was precisely in the 1930s. We're now talking about it also. Larry Summers in the US. Recessions, even depressions, that's what happens. We haven't had a depression, or fortunately, but let's hope COVID doesn't bring one. Xenophobia, It can be the Jews, or it can be the Muslims, or it can be the Mexicans, or whoever. It's always easier to blame somebody that's near when you're unemployed, or when you've lost your, or you now have a much less worse paying job, which will make your life be less good, or you have less hope for your family. You find somebody who must be guilty, and generally it's somebody near. Economic migrations, this is a very strong phenomenon also of these turning point periods. Social unrest, political cleavages. Political parties break up all the time. In fact, the Liberal Party, which was the two parties that were most important, that were practically sharing power in England throughout most of the 19th century, from the middle of the 19th century to the end, were the Conservative and the Liberal Party. But the Liberal Party was actually the result of a division within the Conservative Party and among the Whigs, which were the two parties that were there before. So you have this sort of change, and political parties break up, new political movements emerge, and you have populist messianic leaders. This is a very typical feature also of these periods. And that is with a huge technological potential that lacks a clear, common, synergistic direction. This is exactly what we need for a golden age, is to have all innovation moving in similar directions. I will talk about it in a minute. So it's the historical moment for business and government to identify and act upon the most socially cohesive paths. Now, each revolution brings a paradigm shift and leads to a realignment of the political spectrum. So this is what happens. The people with collective values and goals, and people with individual values and goals, they keep their values, they keep their goals, but then how do they try to get them? Well, some people looking backward and some people looking forward. So that's why political parties divide, because those who want to stick to their old ideas, they stay there. And the ones who want to move forward, who understand there's something different happening, they move forward. And then the parties divide. But at the same time, you have new movements emerging. There is a shift in culture, values and aspirations. I mean, all this climate thing, the vegan thing, all these things are new. Going in a bicycle, thinking that, that maybe you shouldn't be using plastic. All these things are part of the change in values and aspirations. And of course, networks and the fact that we're now communicating this way. All this has to do with aspirations, with everybody wants to have a mobile phone and a better one and so on, rather than having a big TV, which used to be the old ideas. So success in business or politics is going to go to those who best understand and shape the new potential. So the potential is there. It's there at the same time as the problems are there. But the potential is there to solve those problems precisely. And that is why it's so important to understand the moment of history we're living now. So how do we shape the future? What do we do now when we know that we have a potential that can solve the problems? Well, one thing that's important for us to understand is that the space of the viable is very large, but not all viable technologies will be produced successfully. So we have the space of the technologically feasible, but there's only so much of it that's socio-politically acceptable. And within that, there's just so much that's economically profitable. So in fact, technologies, of course, the technologically feasible includes things that used to be feasible and we don't care about them, the old stuff, because things that are technologically feasible don't stop being feasible because we now have better ways of doing it. So that's why it's so much bigger. But anyway, the economically profitable is what will be produced. Obviously, we're in a market economy, And basically, unless some other agent produces it, which could be the state or could be some socially oriented NGO or something like that, basically mostly of what gets produced is the economically profitable, and part of the social politically acceptable is produced by other agents. But in fact, the route from viability to profitability is a socio-economic and political process, because regulations and taxes can be oriented in such a way that some things will become more profitable than others. The obvious case recently is the subsidies for renewable energies, which were not economically profitable to begin with, but through the subsidies, they achieved scale. And as they achieved scale, they now became profitable on their own because they're now cheaper to produce and to install. So it is a socio-political process which shapes the space of the technologically feasible. It's like a stage where the economic and social forces interact. And while each revolution, so you have the widening of the viable by each revolution. So it's social values and policy that will define the profitable. The legitimacy of capitalism depends on its capacity to make the individual search for wealth result in benefits for all. If it doesn't, then you have revolt, then you have, it's precisely because right now we're not seeing the benefits for all. Right now, there are many people that are worse off, but mostly whose children are seen to be worse off than themselves. And that is really what gets people angry. That is what gets people willing to follow any populist leader who will tell them that they have a fantastic solution to offer. So what do we need to unleash a golden age? The state must tilt the playing field in what I've called a synergistic direction, a direction where what everybody does benefits everybody else, so that you get this fantastic common energy for growth and well-being. So in what directions was the mass production revolution politically shaped? Suburbanization and the Cold War. So you had cheap houses on cheap land, full of electrical appliances, with a shopping center, so you can go and buy all the plastically packed things. And that was, and the automobile, which moved everybody. The reason why you could build cheap houses on cheap land is because suburbia were accessible through the car. Without the car, I mean, if you had to have trains, you only have where the station is, and otherwise you're very far and so on. So the price of land changed radically. And that's why suburbanization was possible. And of course, the Cold War allowed going through all the really high-tech things. Actually, it was the state that funded computers, that funded the internet, and the internet was handed over to the private sector by the state, having funded it fully from very early on. So it was handed over in the 90s. So these were the directions, and that was also where the state acted, because not only did it have all the contracts for all the military things, but it also created much of the infrastructure, all the highways and the roads and all these things. In many cases, it also brought all the services to the land where the suburban housing was going to be built. And it also did something very important, which was to back financially the banks when they lent for mortgages. Fannie Mae, the famous Fannie Mae, was created at the end of the 30s by Roosevelt in order to get the banks to feel safe to lend to people with salaries who could be fired any day. You didn't know. So that was a very important act at the time. It was, of course, a time of high taxation and the welfare state. You might not know that the top rate of income tax in the US during the Eisenhower years in the 1950s was 92%. So it wasn't just in Sweden that taxes were high. It was everywhere, because that way it was good for everybody. You took the taxes from the people, put them in the pocket of the state, gave them back to everybody through the welfare state, and that became demand, and therefore it became, in the end, profit. So it was truly a positive sum game, even with taxes. People revolted against taxes when you could no longer get benefits out of them. So in what directions could the ICT revolution be shaped now? Because that is the question we have ahead of us. I suggest it is smart green growth, smart meaning with full use of ICT, green growth so that we are friendly to the planet, growth because we need growth to lift all the poor out of their poverty, and full global development. And I will explain in a minute why that is so important for the advanced world. And that would be with intelligent taxation and redesigning the welfare state. The welfare state, the way it is, no longer works. Just think of one thing. The people who are in gig economy, 0 hours, and unemployed and self-employed, are they employed or unemployed? Their income goes up and down. Are they employed or unemployed? Can they say when they don't have enough? Can they ask the state for help? No, they cannot. So we have a completely obsolete welfare state, and we've got to change it. And intelligent taxation, we probably should have hypothecated. We've got to think of ways, because we now have the technologies with which to make tax more intelligent. We've got to start using technology within the state. Because if we don't use ICT towards an entrepreneurial and agile state, we're going to waste the possibility of really helping a proper golden age. Now, what do I understand by smart green growth? Most importantly, diminishing the material context of GDP and lifestyles. Going from products to services, as we already are doing with film, with books, with things. From possession to rental of durable products, etc. Durable products have got to be properly durable. We also need to reduce the fossil energy content, both the direct and indirect. So, sometimes we use something which is just material, but materials contain all the energy that was needed to process them. Aluminium is practically all energy. We need to redesign the whole food chain for sustainability and sufficiency. Somehow, using hydroponics and all that, we can have a lot of our fresh food grown right around the cities. And that would also be a big job creator. Taking advantage of ICT to maximize productivity and generating greater wealth to improve the lives of all. So we mean growth. It has to be green, but it's got to be enough for everybody. And why is a global sustainable golden age possible with the ICT revolution? Because a lot of people think, these computers using all this energy. It's true. We've got to reduce the energy consumed by the computers. We've got to find new ways of designing the batteries, the energy, the things, how we do all these things. They are all part of this revolution, actually. But basically, the reason why is because dematerialization and globalization are in the nature of the ICT paradigm. So to have a global green golden age is perfectly possible, because that is in the nature of the ICT paradigm. And golden ages depend on a leap in productivity and the demands of a new lifestyle. And both are currently being provided and shaped by ICT. So the productivity and the lifestyle both depend on ICT. So it's useless to try to do some imaginary green golden age which doesn't involve taking advantage of all the power of information technologies. And smart green lifestyles can unleash a prosperous full employment golden age. So an aspirational good life with less energy and materials, more ICT and more jobs. So the human-centered services, health and care, leisure and sports, entertainment, mobility and distribution, diversified electricity with all sorts of different sources and even having it interactive. An education industry. We need education to become a huge industry. Everybody has to learn all sorts of things because now skills are super important. The arts, intermediation, conservation, logistics, sharing and barter, renting, resource recovery, recycling and reuse, pollution reduction, and so on. I mean, it's a different way of approaching the lifestyles. And the modernization of production, the circular economy, truly durable products. Products could last 100 years with the technologies we have. We just had planned obsolescence as a way of making people buy again and again and again. But now we have millions and millions and millions of new consumers, so they can be durable, and we can allow the poorer to enter the consumption ladder quicker. By renting, of course, because we could have a rental economy instead of a possession economy. Diagnostics, maintenance, and rental. Using 3D printing, for instance, for making spare parts. Imagine not producing any more spare parts, but making sure that we redesign all those home appliances and all these things in such a way that every part can be 3D printed. You have it all on the web, and we save on all those materials and all those things that are produced and never bought, and just 3D print on demand. Nanotechnology, renewable energy, batteries and carbon capture, sustainable architecture, new construction methods, bioplastics and custom materials so we can eliminate the problems in our oceans and for our animals and so on. Fiber to the home and Wi-Fi infrastructures, smart electric grid, complex systems engineering, hydroponics and urban agriculture, and so on. So we have a whole range of possibilities. With massive innovation and massive employment in sustainable activities, enhanced and enabled by ICT, while also using robotics and artificial intelligence. We have to get every society that's in a golden age has a part of it, which is very, very high productivity with very low employment, but very high wealth creation. And then a whole range of activities which are not as highly productive, but that are well paid, because the wealth that's produced on average in a society is enough to lift all boats. So we are interested in the very high productivity technologies also, and we don't have to fear the job destruction as long as we are creating jobs. This whole idea, for instance, of having a rental economy. Imagine if the workers that have lost their jobs from assembly were able to come into a rental maintenance economy where they would do diagnostics, 3D print parts, introduce them, go and install them in people's homes, all these things. We would have hundreds of thousands of jobs for people who actually lost their manufacturing jobs but have the skills and can very quickly learn. So we have to think big. We have to think big in order to solve society's problems with this enormous potential that technology is providing. And another question, you might wonder, why would the advanced world be interested in full global development? Well, it is very important because it would provide dynamic demand for equipment, engineering, high-tech, and luxury goods and services. Because most consumer goods are now produced in Asia, and they will only return to the advanced world with robots. They're not going to return with people. I mean, when you have these supposedly middle-income jobs, notice that that's very important. The jobs, the blue-collar jobs, assembly jobs in manufacturing were very well paid. But when they moved to Asia, they became low-paid jobs. So it wasn't in the nature of the job, it was in the nature of the society. So it is a social political choice what we pay. We have now discovered that the essential workers are the ones that are delivering the really badly paid. Well, this society has got to decide whether it thinks it's okay to pay so badly people who are so crucial for our existence. So that is something that we have to understand. Wages, levels of wages and salaries are socio-politically determined. So now, because we need those jobs, it could be wonderful if the developing world were all developing, they would be producing all sorts of things. They would need equipment, they would need engineering, they would need training, all things that can be provided by the advanced world, while they then would be exporting and we would have a positive sum game across the globe. So, but also it would diminish migratory pressures, which are also very important for the advanced world. So it would be a positive sum game among advanced, emerging, and developing countries. And now the final question. We're in the middle of this pandemic. The state has had to come in very fully to solve almost every one of the many, many, many problems that have been brought up and have been revealed by the pandemic. But there is something very important to understand. You know, the economy was in for a collapse. Finance had already decoupled from the real economy for the third time. Let me show you. This is, the red is the Dow Jones Industrials. The blue is GDP in current, so that means with inflation. That's what we really think. And this is in constant. So GDP has grown very little throughout this whole period. In money terms, it looks like more. But look at how the Dow Jones has moved. We have the Nasdaq bubble. Then we have the easy credit bubble. And here we have our current financial casino bubble. Look, much, much bigger, much, much further from current GDP. This was not realistic. This is all this hype that does not represent real growth. It is not about more jobs. It is not about more well-being. It's about some companies just becoming very expensive, very valuable, as they say. I don't know if the word value and the word price are not, as Mariana Mazzucato would say, to be re-examined. So this was going to collapse, just like the other two had collapsed. But then this decoupling of the economy has been reconnected through COVID-19, because what collapsed was not just the bubble, was not just the debt bubble in the whole world, which is also another huge thing, which I could also show you in another graph. So we had the financial collapse ready to happen, and it happened, but it happened together with an economic collapse of the real economy and with a social collapse, because we saw all the jobs lost and all, you know, the reality of the gig economy and all these things. So what this means is that now governments can't just come in and save the banks again. No, the shape of the recovery is going to depend on government, because it's going to have to look at the whole thing. And that, since golden ages are about faster growth and less volatile stock markets, then we are in for a possible better change. We might really now have the golden age ahead, because the pandemic has changed the context radically. As after World War, we have the need for reconstruction, so we can't go back to austerity. And you know, wars have always been financed by huge debt, which then is paid by taxes, because You don't expect that it's going to be paid by further cuts. We can't cut anymore. So we need to reconstruct with proper funding. We are all in this together. That's another thing we discovered in this, as in the World War. So we recognize that both national and global interdependence are a reality. We can no longer ignore that we're all in this together. Government as the expected legitimate solution for everything. That's what happened now. Everybody understood, you know, we're in trouble, we don't have jobs, government comes in. You know, it was being said that the government was the problem. The government now comes back to be the solution. Then all the hidden truths that were revealed that will be requiring such solutions. Inequality and precarious jobs, we've got to find a way. I don't think it's a question of turning all the precarious jobs into full-time jobs with all the rights as before. That's the old welfare state. We've got to invent a new one. We probably have to introduce universal basic income. It is a very intelligent solution that can be handled by computers. Everybody gets their money in ATM. People who earn enough turn it back in their taxes because that's how it happens. And all the ones that need it, nobody dies of hunger. You know, it's a completely different world if you manage to do universal basic income, and that might be something to study seriously. The inadequacy of the safety net, which has to do with that. The fact that health is crucial and some services are essential. So we have to think of those essential services, how to pay them, how to train people, how to organize them, and of course the health problem and the possibility of further pandemics. The importance of migrants, how do we deal with that? Globalization is frail and insecure. So both company strategies and country strategies, we have to think of strategic risks, which were not, you know, people were just not ignoring that. We've had all this problem with the PPE, that in order to get delivery, it was all being produced in China, and China was itself in this huge problem because that's where the pandemic had initiated and so on. So we have problems like that. And the new digital and green behaviors that we are learning, like what we're doing now. So working from home, meetings without travel, experiencing clean air and water. So we're opening the door to a green way of doing things, making it easier, and opening the door for government to shape that green future. That could be that green global future. We have to redesign globalization where everybody is incorporated. So in fact, some of yesterday's seemingly bold and unlikely change proposals, like the universal basic income I just mentioned, are becoming acceptable and even probable. So we are in a very different situation. Emmanuel Macron recently said, the day after we have conquered this virus, it will not be a return to the day before. We will be stronger morally, and we will draw all of the consequences. Will we? A green, socially sustainable global golden age is technologically possible. Whether it becomes a reality will depend on all of us. Thank you. Now, since you're not there, and I'm here completely alone, I would like to be able to communicate with you somehow. So if any of you have comments, questions, it would be wonderful for you to send them to Baillie Gifford. They will probably give you an address, so that maybe in a couple of weeks, we could put them together and we could answer them somehow, so that we can have more of a reality of having communicated through this medium. Thank you very much. And I hope what I've said is of use to you.